before Thundera exploded, before Leo escaped to the third planet, before the Sword of Omens existed. As we know it, there was a king who killed his own father in order to rule. And that wasn't the only secret Thundera kept for millions of years. Today we're going to tell the full story that the 80s animated series never showed. How did a planet of violent predators become the civilization we know? Who forged the most powerful sword ever created, and why? Did a blind warrior have to hand over the power to his best friend at the most dangerous moment in all of Thundera's history? In the void of the universe, among countless galaxies filled with innumerable planets, there was a world that did not yet have a name. Millions of years would pass before anyone pointed it out on a map, but we already know its name, Thundera. However, the Thundera that we all remember. The towers, the cat's lair, the civilization unified under the Thundera code did not always exist. Before that Thundera, there was another, completely different. A planet ruled by instinct, not by reason. The first inhabitants of Thundera were not nobles or warriors with a code of honor. They were predators. Their biological evolution had to be completed before any form of society could exist. And that process took entire eras. When they finally began to walk upright and develop hands capable of holding tools, they still retained the hunting and territorial instincts of their ancestors. The first thing they developed wasn't language, it was weapons. Think about it. Long before they could name fear, they already knew how to inflict harm. The first tribes were formed, not out of cooperation, but for survival. They discovered that strength was in numbers, in the pack. But that trust had strict limits. Any outsider was by definition a threat. And so those packs began to expand, to clash with each other, to fight for territory and resources. The culture that emerged from that process was, as expected, a culture of war. For thousands of years, each tribe of Thundera fought against the others for dominance and power. We are not exaggerating when we say that millions of lives were lost before anything resembling civilization could emerge. Among those tribes, one stood out for its ferocity in battle, to the point that its name became synonymous with war in the oldest Thunderian records. They were the Megaterions, warriors who mastered hand-to-hand combat with a brutality that no other tribe could match. It was they who, under the command of their leader, united the first two great rival tribes to bring war to a scale never before seen in Thundera. And this is where the story takes its first major turn, because the son of that same warrior leader would do exactly the opposite of what was expected of him. His name was Megaterion, and the irony of his story is that he was the son of the leader of the Megaterions, the tribe that had brought the war to its bloodiest point. But when Megaterion took power, he did exactly the opposite of what his lineage suggested. He united the main tribes of Thundera under a single government and began an era of peace that would last for more than a century. To achieve this, Megaterion did not impose his rule by force, as previous generations had done. Instead, he summoned the nobility of each rival tribe to negotiate, something that in that primitive Thundera was almost unthinkable. The result of those negotiations was the first code of coexistence between tribes that existed on the planet. The seed of what centuries later would become the Thundera code that we all know. His more than 100-year reign was the foundation for everything that followed. Under his rule, the nobility of each tribe gathered to form a new governing and protective body, the first Thundercats. Before he died, Megaterion began the construction of a capital city for the now unified tribes, along with what would be the first headquarters of the Thundercats, the first Kubil. He didn't live to see it finished. Months before the project was completed, Megaterion passed away, but he left behind someone capable of completing his legacy, his godson, Leo, from the Lion tribe. Leo's story deserves a pause, because it is one of the most moving in the entire Thunderian lineage. Leo was the son of Megaterion's worst enemy. When Leo's family was caught in the conflict, Megaterion, the very man who had been his rival, decided to raise him as if he were his own son. He didn't do it out of guilt or pity. He did it because he understood that the only way to break the cycle of revenge that had consumed Thundera for thousands of years was to raise the next generation under a different principle than the one he himself had inherited. Over time, that young man became his closest ally, and after the death of Megaterion, the first official lord of the Thundercats, during Leo's reign, the capital was transformed into a flourishing metropolis. And generations later, one of his descendants on the throne would lead Thundera toward another crucial leap. It was he who discovered the Eye of Thundera, a gem with properties that no Thunderian of his time fully understood yet. And he was the one who began to narrate what we now know as the Book of Omens, the sacred record that would document every great event in the history of his people from that moment on. But the peace that Megaterion had built would not last forever. Generations would pass, but Thundera was about to face its first war beyond its own planet, and from that war, the most powerful weapon ever forged would be born. The successor who would face that war was Thoros, responsible for what Thunderian historians would later call the Thunderian Renaissance, a complete reform of society that led his people into a new era of development. Under his reign, Thundera stopped being an isolated planet and began to have contact, not always peaceful, with other worlds. That contact brought with it the first truly external threat that Thundera had ever faced, an invading force ready to take their planet away from them. And among the king's generals, there was a figure who would become a legend, Kugarta, also known in later records as Kugarta, one of the most feared warriors, male or female, depending on the version, in the entire military history of Thundera. When the time for interplanetary war came, Kugarta did not face it as just another general. She faced it as the new lord of the Thundercats, and it was she who led her people to a swift victory with minimal losses compared to any other conflict that Thundera had experienced before. How did she achieve this with so few casualties against an enemy that came from space, with technology that Thundera was only beginning to understand? The answer lies in a new weapon, one that would change the fate of Thundera forever. This is where the story gets really interesting, because the weapon that would define the Thundercats for generations was not born as a magical symbol. It was born as a gift between two people who deeply respected each other. Tigris was one of the best blacksmiths Thundera had ever produced. His creations were rare. He worked on few pieces, but each one was worth its weight in gold. He didn't forge for the market or for the army in general. He only forged when he found a purpose he considered worthy of his work. Thundera suffered an attack that left Kugarta wounded, an attack that, according to the records, aimed to destabilize the Thunderian leadership. Right before the outbreak of the interplanetary war, Tigris saw the opportunity to honor his leader in the only way he knew how, forging the largest and best balanced sword blade he had ever made. The forging process was not quick. Tigris worked the metal with a care that his own apprentices later described as obsessive, adjusting the weight and balance of the blade over and over until he achieved something no blacksmith in Thundera had ever accomplished before. A weapon that felt like a natural extension of the arm of its wielder, without the dead weight that characterized the ceremonial swords of the time. According to later records in Thunderian history, Tigris considered it his supreme masterpiece. He gave it to him just before the brewing interplanetary war broke out. But when Kugarta received it, he asked for something more. He didn't just want a powerful weapon. He wanted a weapon that would protect Thundera, that would guide the Thundercats in battle beyond mere physical strength. He asked Tigris for a modification that no blacksmith had ever attempted before, to insert the mystical Eye of Thundera, that same gem that Leo II had discovered generations ago between the hilt and the blade. Tigris accepted the challenge, even though he knew that working with a relic of such power involved a risk that no conventional forge could handle. And so, from the union between the finest steel ever forged in Thundera and the planet's most sacred relic, the weapon that would change history forever was born, the Sword of Omens. With that sword, Kugarta led the Thundercats to victory against the first interplanetary enemy in their history. But what came after his reign is one of the darkest and least told chapters in all of Thundera's history. The records are not clear about who immediately succeeded. What we do know is that generations later, one of the lords of Thundera was the father of Claudus, the same Claudus who years later we would know as the father of Lionho. But before that Claudus we all remember existed, there was a feline who led that same lineage into darkness. This ancestor of Claudus was, according to the records, a cruel being who murdered his own father with the sole purpose of becoming Lord of Thundera. Only with time did the truth come to light, and that villain was banished, forced to leave the capital that his own ancestors had helped build. But exile did not end the story. Before this young Claudus, son of the usurper, could be recognized as the new legitimate Lord of Thundera, he had to face the hardest trial of all. A challenge both physical and psychological. He had to face his own exiled father, who had become a real threat, seeking war not to protect Thundera, but to regain the power he had lost. Claudus gathered his courage and accepted the challenge. During the fight, he discovered something that would mark him forever. To his own father, he had always been a disappointment, someone who was never considered worthy of ruling. When his father tried a treacherous attack during the duel, Claudus had no choice. He took his father's life. Thus, amidst blood and betrayal within his own family, was born Claudus, who years later would become the father of Lion Leon and the last great lord of Thundera before its destruction. And that beginning marked by violence would paradoxically forge one of the most respected warriors in all of Thunderian history. Before losing his sight, before becoming the prudent and worn-out father we know from the animated series, Claudus was, according to the records of his time, the most extraordinary warrior that Thundera had ever produced. And he didn't build that reputation in a single battle, but in a war that lasted for years against the most persistent enemy his people had ever faced, the Mutants of Plundar. The Mutants were neither a rival tribe nor a conventional. They were a hostile, technologically aggressive force, determined to take Thundera's resources and eventually control of the entire planet. Battle after battle, it was Claudus who, wielding the Sword of Omens as Lord of the Thundercats, single-handedly managed to reverse the course of battles that his own generals already considered. That war did not have a clean ending or a total victory. It was a constant struggle, year after year, until, in one of those battles against the Mutants, Claudus paid the highest price a warrior can pay without losing his life. He lost his sight completely. For any other Lord of Thundera, that would have meant the immediate end of his reign. But Claudus, even blind, refused to abandon his people without first making sure everything was in order. And this is where the second great name of this era enters the story. Yaga, also known as Yaga the Wise, Claudus's closest friend since long before this war. Claudus knew that a blind lord of the Thundercats, unable to see danger coming, was a risk that Thundera could not afford. So he made a decision that few rulers in history would be able to make. He handed over the mantle of power to someone else, while he was still alive. The transition ceremony was not just a simple formality. Now blind, insisted on presiding over it personally, leaning on his cane, in front of the same nobility that years earlier had seen him become lord after the duel with his own father. He handed Yaga the Sword of Omens, the weapon that Tigris had forged generations ago for Kugarta, the same one Claudus had wielded throughout the entire war against the Mutants of Plundar. With it, he also entrusted him with the responsibility of protecting the Eye of Thundera, and with it, the entire destiny of his people. Yaga accepted the position not out of ambition but out of loyalty. He had already earned, long before this moment, the reputation of being one of the wisest and most compassionate Thundercats of his generation, qualities that would become indispensable for what was to come. Although at that moment, no one in Thundera could imagine the magnitude of what was approaching. Already freed from the burden of direct leadership, remained at court as an advisor, entrusting Yaga with the burden of every decision, but never completely distancing himself from the affairs of his people. It was precisely in that new role, as an advisor and no longer as a lord, that Claudus would find himself, years later, facing alongside Yaga the threat that neither of them saw coming. Over time, Thundera achieved lasting peace, but it was never completely free from threats. A sorcerer of immense power, known as the Master of Shadows, would become the greatest challenge that Claudus and Yaga would face together. No longer as lord and successor, but as allies and friends. He was considered the most powerful wizard that Thundera had ever produced. But Claudus, now without the mantle of lord, and Yaga, now leading the Thundercats, joined forces once again. Claudus, guided by his experience from a lifetime of battle, and Yaga wielding the Sword of Omens, put an end to the constant threats of the sorcerer. They banished him to the realm of shadows, that plane from which it was said no one ever returned. It was a victory that sealed for generations the reputation of Claudus and Yaga as the two greatest Thundercats of their time. What neither of them knew was that this banishment would come back to haunt them. A long time later, with the Master of Shadows banished and Thundera enjoying a peace it hadn't known for generations, Yaga ruled for years without major disturbances. By her side, as the general in command of Thundera's armies, was Grune, a warrior whose own great-grandfather had been Lord of the Thundercats generations before, who for a long time was considered one of Yaga's closest and most loyal friends. Grune was not a traitor from the beginning. He was, according to the records of the time, a brilliant general on the battlefield, someone whom Yaga trusted without reservation. But the years of peace that followed the defeat of the Lord of Shadows brought with them something Grune did not expect to find in himself: boredom, and with it a hunger for power that grew in silence. Grune began to consider that his people did not deserve the unconditional service of warriors like him. He began to see himself not as a protector of Thundera, but as someone destined to rule it directly. Almost like a deity above the traditional nobility. That conviction, nurtured for years without anyone around him, noticing, eventually turned into a concrete plan. A military coup to seize power from his own friend. When Grune finally made his move, he gathered a group of followers within the Thunderian army itself. Soldiers who, like him, had begun to question the legitimacy of a government based on ancient codes instead of brute force. But Yaga, warned in time, did not hesitate to confront him directly. What followed was one of the longest battles ever recorded between two Thundercats. Hours of hand-to-hand combat between two warriors who had once fought side by side, now as sworn enemies. Yaga, wielding the Sword of Omens, ended up prevailing over his former friend. But Yaga did not sentence him to death. Instead, he used the power of the sword itself, trapped Grune inside a crystal vessel, and banished him to space, sending him far away from Thundera forever. It was a sentence that, in time, Yaga would have plenty of reasons to regret not having made it permanent. Many years later, and far from Thundera, would still be alive, harboring a grudge that never truly faded away. Yaga had survived the betrayal of his closest friend, but the conflict that would truly determine Thundera's ultimate fate, the one none of the Thundercats saw coming, and which involved a weapon believed to be lost forever, was still yet to come. After Grune's betrayal, Yaga understood that he could no longer entrust the command of his armies to a single charismatic figure without oversight, so he began to train, much more carefully, the next generation of warriors who would protect Thundera. Two names from that new generation would become central figures in what was to come. Panthro earned his place not by inheritance or noble lineage, but through a physical and strategic discipline that Yaga recognized from a young age. He became one of the most reliable warriors in the Thunderian army, someone capable of keeping calm even when circumstances demanded immediate decisions under extreme pressure. For his part, stood out for a rare combination of speed, stealth, and survival instinct. Qualities that made him indispensable in missions where brute force was not enough. Neither of them imagined at that moment that Yaga had been training them without saying it openly, for a scenario that he himself was only beginning to fear. A day when Thundera would need to evacuate its people faster than any contingency plan could anticipate. His betrayal also left another mark, less visible but just as important. It forced Yaga to reinforce the code of Thundera, the same set of principles that had been built since the time of Megaterion. With Yaga's new emphasis, no general, no matter how brilliant on the battlefield, could ever again accumulate the kind of personal power that Grune had reached without oversight. From then on, major military decisions would be made by the full council of nobles, not by the will of a single commander. It was, in a sense, the last major institutional reform that Thundera would complete before its destruction. And although no one could know it at that moment, that same system of collective decision-making, slow, deliberative, designed to prevent a single man from concentrating too much power, would be exactly what would later make a quick response difficult. When the real threat, much quieter than any human betrayal, began to take shape in the depths of the planet. And so, my friends, we come to the end of this first part of the story. We started in a primitive Thundera ruled by predators who barely knew language, and we saw how Megaterion, son of one of the most violent war leaders of his time, managed to break that cycle and lay the foundations for what would become the Thundercats. We saw Leo inherit that legacy, despite being the son of his adoptive father's enemy, a fact that would define the fate of entire generations. We saw the Sword of Omens being forged thanks to the skill of Tigris and the vision of Kugarta, a weapon that would later lead Claudus to become the greatest warrior of his time, someone capable of enduring years of war against the Mutants of Plundar until he paid the highest price, his own sight. And we saw that rare act of humility when, already blind, he decided to hand over power to his friend Yaga instead of clinging to the throne. Finally, we saw that same Yaga survive the betrayal of his closest friend, Grune, and strengthen the code of Thundera so that something like that would never happen again. Without knowing that this very system, designed to protect them from the ambition of a single man, would have no way to protect them from the silent threat that was already brewing beneath the surface of the planet. Because far from Thundera, deep within its most dangerous canyons, there was a weapon believed to be sealed away forever. The Sword of Thundera. And the confrontation Yaga was about to have over it would end up unleashing, without him knowing, the total destruction of life on his planet. If you liked this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe so you don't miss the second part. And if you want to understand who the Master of Shadows really was and what happened to him after these events, I'll leave the link to our complete series about Mamra up here in the description. See you in the next video. Bye.